The median retirement savings for an American household is $87,000. The number those same Americans think they need to retire comfortably is 1.46 million. That gap, $1.37 million, is not a rounding error. It represents roughly 17 years of median household income in cash that most people are missing. And here is what makes that number genuinely alarming. Most of the people sitting on that $87,000 were, at some point in their 50s, earning more money than they had ever earned in their lives. Some were pulling in six figures. Some were getting the bonuses. The income was there. What wasn't there was a specific structural understanding of the one thing their 50s would demand from them, and they missed it while everything else felt like it was finally working. There are 4 layers to that mistake. By the end of this video, you'll have seen all of them. And I'll tell you up front, the 4th one is the one that kills retirement plans that look completely fine on paper. I need to say something clearly before we go any further, because the framing matters. This video is not about irresponsible people. It is not about people who didn't know they should be saving or who blew their money on things they didn't care about. The people who retire overwhelmingly did the things they were told to do. They opened 401k accounts. They paid a financial advisor 1% of their assets per year to tell them to stay the course. They funded their kids' college. They helped their parents when things got difficult. The mistake they made was not laziness, and it was not ignorance. It was a cluster of decisions that all made sense in isolation and were catastrophic in combination. And they all happened during the decade when everything finally felt like it was working. That is the most dangerous kind of mistake, the kind that feels like success. Here's the metaphor I want you to hold in your head for this entire video, and I'll keep returning to it. Think about what a plane needs to take off. It needs the full length of the runway, not 90% of it, the whole thing. The speed has to build across the entire strip because of how lift works, the acceleration compounds. If the plane is going too slowly at the start, it cannot make up the difference in the final stretch. Your 50s are the last third of the runway. The compounding you didn't do in your 30s and 40s can still be partially recovered here, but only if you use the full strip. What most people do instead is treat this last stretch as a destination, not a launch pad. They slow down, and the plane never lifts. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you the single most underreported retirement risk in America, one that has almost nothing to do with investment returns and everything to do with the statistical reality about employment that most people in their 50s have never seen in writing. But first, let me show you the specific financial trap that makes that risk so much worse when it arrives. Here is the first part of the mistake. Generation X people currently in their late 40s and early 60s spends more than any other age group, with average annual household expenditures of nearly $96,000, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Read that again. Not the lowest earning generation, the highest spending generation. Lifestyle creep is always a risk for savers, but it can be particularly damaging in your 50s. At that age, income typically peaks and expenses could theoretically decline. The key word there is could. In practice, spending accelerates instead, and the reason is psychological more than financial. When you hit your 50s with a decent income, something shifts in your brain. After 25 years of deferring, of telling yourself that the vacation could wait and the kitchen was fine the way it was, you finally have the money to stop deferring. And that feeling that you have earned this is not irrational. It is one of the most human things in the world. The boat is not a mistake. The renovation is not a mistake. What is a mistake is failing to understand what each of those purchases does to your retirement math. Here is the specific mechanism. Whatever you spend during your peak earning years becomes the baseline your retirement needs to sustain. Your 50s often bring peak earnings, and peak earnings have a way of quietly becoming peak spending. A bigger house, nicer cars, more travel, each upgrade feels earned, but together they reset your cost of living to a level your retirement savings may not support. Worse, a higher lifestyle means you need an even bigger nest egg to maintain it. If your spending climbs from $70,000 a year to $90,000 a year in your 50s, you have just added roughly $500,000 to your required retirement number under standard withdrawal math. Not from a bad investment, from a kitchen and a slightly nicer car. And almost no one is running that specific calculation when they're approving the contractor's estimate. According to the Federal Reserve, Americans in their 50s now hold more debt in the form of mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards than previous generations did at the same age. That is not a data point about reckless behavior. That is a data point about the aggregate weight of a generation that finally started spending like it was allowed to. Now, I want to introduce someone who makes this concrete. I'll call him Marcus. He is 52 years old. He earns $140,000 a year as a project manager for an engineering firm. By almost every external measure, Marcus looks like he's doing well. He has a 401k with $380,000 in it. He owns a house with reasonable equity. His kids are in college, almost done. He's got a financial advisor. He's contributing to his 401k. And Marcus has been telling himself for 3 years that once the kids are done with school, he'll really start maxing things out. That plan is the trap. I'll come back to Marcus at the end of this video with the actual numbers. But first, I need to show you what's happening to his savings right now in the 3-drain structure that hits almost every person in his position simultaneously. A Bankrate survey from 2024 showed 61% of parents made financial sacrifices to help their grown kids. 61%. That means more than half of the people in their prime wealth building years are actively routing retirement capital toward adult children. And I am not making an argument here about parenting. I'm making a mathematical argument. Your children have decades to recover from a financial setback, and you do not. You can borrow for almost anything: a car, a house, an education, except retirement. No one will lend you money to fund your 70s. The second drain is the aging parent problem. Roughly 50 million Americans are providing some form of caregiving to an older adult. When that caregiver is in their 50s, the timing is brutal because they are being financially squeezed from both sides at the exact moment they should be loading capital onto the runway. The third drain is invisible. It is the psychological shift that happens when the fear of being broke finally goes quiet. In your 30s and 40s, financial anxiety is actually a useful tool. It drives discipline. It makes you say no to things. When income peaks in your 50s and the immediate pressure lifts, that anxiety dissolves. And with it, the behavioral engine that built your savings in the first place. The discipline relaxes at the exact moment it needs to intensify. Not because you got lazy, because you finally feel safe. And feeling safe in this context is expensive. You might be thinking, okay, that's all behavioral stuff. I can manage that. But here is where I want to flip the script entirely. You think the problem is spending too much. The actual problem is planning around an assumption that the data says is almost certainly wrong. Stay with me, because this next part changes the math on everything we've discussed so far. Here's a statistic that gets almost no airtime in mainstream financial media. More than half of all workers age 50 and older lost their long-held jobs because they were laid off or otherwise forced to leave involuntarily. A study from the Urban Institute found the research suggests that many older workers encounter unexpected financial setbacks during the period when saving and planning for retirement is most critical. More than half. Overall, 66% of people working full-time in their early 50s on a long-term job subsequently left their employer involuntarily. Let me be precise about what that study was looking at. The research focused on workers who enter their 50s with stable, full-time jobs and who've been with the same employer for at least 5 years, those who are least likely to encounter employment problems. The study considered only separations that resulted in at least 6 months of unemployment, or at least a 50% drop in earnings. These are not the marginal workers, the ones with spotty records, the ones already on shaky ground. 28% of stable, long-time employees sustained at least one damaging layoff by their employers between turning 50 and leaving work for retirement. We've known that some workers get a nudge from their employers to exit the workforce, and some get a great big kick, said Gary Burtless, a prominent labor economist with the Brookings Institution. Your position may feel secure, especially if you've been employed for a long time, but artificial intelligence is disrupting the labor market. In March of 2025, AI was the leading reason for job cuts by US-based employers, According to a report from Challenger, Gray, and Christmas, the structural forces pushing older workers out of employment are accelerating, not decelerating. Now here's what happens when the exit comes before you planned. When older workers find a new job after involuntary separation, they earn on average 25% less than their previous salary. The plan to catch up to maximize contributions for the remaining years is built on the assumption that the remaining years are fully yours to control. For the majority of workers in their 50s, they are not. And the chain reaction that follows is textbook. As unemployed workers reach Social Security eligibility at age 62, the risk increases that they will stop their job searches. Those who opt for early entry into retirement face further financial risk. With 40% of workers in their 50s today who retire at age 62 likely to see their income levels fall to less than twice the federal poverty level. Claiming Social Security at 62 instead of waiting until your full retirement age at 67 means accepting permanently reduced benefits, not temporarily, for life. The impact continues into retirement, with median income in households that experience an involuntary job loss being 14% lower than for those who did not, even though the two groups had nearly identical earning levels before unemployment. The plan to save more once the kids are done doesn't survive the layoff notice. The plane ran out of runway. Knowing these numbers is one thing. Building a system around them is a different problem. I had this exact data for years before I understood how to turn it into an actual plan. That gap between knowing the risk and having a framework to protect against it is why I spent about a year building the exit code. It's a digital book, 8 chapters of retirement data analysis with no filler, built around a mathematical framework for turning a vague retirement dream into a specific, defensible date. It covers what I call the 58% rule, the buffer structure you need to protect against the forced exit. Because the data says that involuntary early retirement is not an edge case. It is the median outcome for workers in stable, full-time jobs entering their 50s. It also covers the $14,000 invisible bill, the healthcare cost that destroys retirement timelines that look perfectly funded on paper, which I'll explain in the next section. And it covers the dynamic withdrawal method, which replaces the rigid 4% rule with a strategy that actually accounts for the way spending changes across a 30-year retirement. The exit code is built on 50 years of actual retirement data, and you can get it for less than 1 hour with a mediocre financial advisor through the link in the description. The difference between knowing this data and having a system around it is the difference between watching the problem happen and actually solving it in advance. By the way, hit subscribe if you like the content, otherwise YouTube's algorithm may never show you my videos again. Now, let me show you the thing that doesn't show up on any standard retirement calculator, because it sits in the gap between leaving work and turning 65. Your retirement plan almost certainly has a healthcare line, and it almost certainly starts at 65 when Medicare kicks in. That 3-year gap from 62 to 65, if you get pushed out early, or choose to leave early, is where the invisible bill lives. Health insurance represents one of the largest expenses for individuals who retire before age 65. Monthly premiums of roughly $1,100 to $1,200 per person can meaningfully affect how long retirement savings last, especially when combined with other core costs. Because these expenses occur before Medicare eligibility begins, early retirees often need to account for several years of higher healthcare costs when determining whether their retirement timeline is financially sustainable. Let me translate that into annual numbers. Healthcare may account for a significant share of retirement income. Paying about $13,000 to $14,000 per year in premiums per person can consume a notable portion of annual retirement income, particularly for households relying on withdrawals from savings or investments. For a couple, that's $26,000 to $28,000 per year in premiums, before any actual medical expenses, before co-pays, before prescriptions. At the end of 2025, the enhanced premium tax credits that had lowered ACA premiums since 2021 expired and were not renewed for 2026. For early retirees, the subsidy cliff is back, so anyone earning above roughly $62,600 as a single person in 2026 pays full price for marketplace coverage, which can exceed $1,500 a month at age 62 in some rating areas. $1,500 a month per person. And here is where I want to talk about what happens after 65. Because the assumption that Medicare solves the problem is also wrong. Healthcare is one of the largest expenses Americans face in retirement, but it's also one of the hardest to estimate. According to Fidelity Investments' 2025 retiree healthcare cost estimate, the average 65-year-old who retired in 2025 will spend an average of $172,500 on healthcare and medical expenses throughout retirement, not including long-term care costs. $172,500, not including the nursing home, not including long-term care. Long-term care costs can range from roughly $50,000 per year for home care to more than $110,000 per year for nursing home care, with an average need of about 33 months. There's a comedian's version of this, which is you spend your entire working life afraid of running out of money, and then you retire and discover there's a line item called your body that nobody put in the spreadsheet. Unfortunately, it's not funny when it's your portfolio. Nearly 2 in 3 Americans, 64%, are more worried about going broke in retirement than dying, according to the 2025 annual retirement study from the Allianz Center for the Future of Retirement. That statistic used to strike me as a kind of dark comedy. Now it strikes me as completely rational. Here is where the fourth part of the mistake lives. And this is the one I saved for last, because it's the one that can torpedo a portfolio that survived everything else. It can destroy a retirement plan that successfully avoided the lifestyle creep, successfully prepared for the forced exit, and correctly modeled the healthcare costs. It is invisible during the accumulation phase. It only reveals itself once you start withdrawing. And it is almost completely determined by luck, unless you build a specific structure to neutralize it. Now you're asking yourself, what could possibly be both that dangerous and that invisible? Let me show you through 2 people. Meet Arthur and Betty. They are siblings. They both retire at 65. Both have exactly $1 million saved. Same portfolio. Same withdrawal strategy. $40,000 a year, adjusted for inflation. Same target average annual return of 7% over 30 years. On paper, they are identical. In practice, their retirements will diverge so dramatically that one of them will run out of money. Arthur experiences poor returns early. His portfolio loses 15% in year 1, 10% in year 2, and 5% in year 3. The recovery comes later. After just 3 years, Arthur's portfolio has fallen 39%, despite withdrawing only about 12% of the original balance. Every month Arthur withdraws money during that crash, he is selling shares at a discount. Those shares are gone. They cannot participate in the recovery because they no longer exist in his portfolio. When the market eventually comes back, Arthur is recovering from a much smaller base. Betty, who gets the same returns in reverse order, the good years first, the bad years later, is fine. Her compounding built a cushion before the losses came. Sequence of returns risk isn't just about the average return you get in retirement. It's about when those returns happen. 2 retirees could earn the exact same average annual return over 20 years. But if one experiences big losses early on while taking withdrawals, their portfolio can deplete far faster than the others. Research by Wade Powell estimates that approximately 77% of a portfolio's final retirement outcome can be explained by the returns of just the first 10 years. 77% of whether you run out of money in retirement is determined by what the market does in your first decade of withdrawals. You cannot control when you retire relative to market cycles, but you can build a structure that insulates your first 3 to 5 years of withdrawals from having to come from a portfolio that might be underwater. Cash buffer strategies, bond ladders, non-correlated income sources. These are not conservative investor nonsense. They are structural defenses against the one risk that decent average returns cannot protect you from. 2 retirees with identical portfolios and average returns can experience nearly a $500,000 difference in ending values solely based on when losses occur. $500,000. Not from different investment choices, not from different savings rates, purely from the order in which the market moves. Morningstar's December 2025 State of Retirement Income Report put the 2026 safe withdrawal rate at 3.9% for portfolios with 30 to 60% in stocks, based on forward-looking market forecasts, and a 90% chance the money lasts 30 years. The rule that a generation of financial advisors sold you 4%, set it and forget it, was built on market data from 1994. It was a reasonable approximation for a different era, built on data that no longer reflects the return environment we're planning through. Here's something I find genuinely funny in that dark comedy way that finance sometimes forces on you. The standard conversation most people have with their advisor about retirement readiness is, do I have enough? Nobody asks, have I built a buffer for the first 5 years of withdrawals? Nobody asks, what is my exposure to sequence risk at this portfolio allocation? These are the questions that actually determine whether the retirement lasts, but they're not in the standard playbook because they require more work than running a Monte Carlo simulation and handing over a color-coded pie chart. Now let me bring Marcus back because his story ends in a specific place. Marcus, our 52-year-old engineer, making $140,000 a year with $380,000 in his 401k. He's behind the Fidelity benchmark of 6 times salary, which would put him at $840,000. He's sitting on about 45% of where he should be. The guideline suggests saving 6 times your annual salary by age 50. He missed that marker, but he has time in theory. Here's what his actual situation looks like if we run the numbers honestly. His company is in a consolidating industry. He has been at the same firm for 11 years. His role is senior enough to be expensive and junior enough to be cuttable. If he gets pushed out at 58, which the Urban Institute data says is more likely than not, he has 6 years to build, not 15. 6 years of maximum catch-up contributions at $32,500 a year gets him an additional $195,000. Add growth at 7% annually, and he lands somewhere around $620,000 total. Call it $650,000 with some optimism. The number he actually needs? The 2026 Northwestern Mutual Planning and Progress Study puts the figure at $1.46 million to retire comfortably. At 3.9% withdrawal on $650,000, Marcus generates $25,350 a year before taxes. The average American household spends over $77,000 annually. About 45% of Americans will experience retirement funding shortfalls if they retire at 65, according to Morningstar's projections. Marcus is not in the 45% because he did something wrong. He's in the 45% because the plan he made was built on an assumption that he would control his exit that the data says is probably false. What could actually change his outcome? 2 things that are still available to him at 52. First, he stops routing money to the lake house mortgage and the adult children buffer and treats those funds as runway. Every extra dollar invested now at 52 has 15 years to compound before the earliest plausible forced exit. Second, he builds a parallel buffer, 2 years of living expenses, in a combination of short-term bonds and cash, specifically designated to protect his portfolio's early withdrawal years from sequence of returns. Damage. The buffer doesn't earn much. That's not its job. Its job is to make sure he never has to sell equities during a downturn in his first 3 years of retirement. These are not complicated strategies. They're not new. They're just invisible behind the noise of the broader financial planning conversation, which is mostly still having the wrong argument. So here are the 3 practical things that are specific to this problem and non-generic. The first, run your retirement number assuming you stop working at 62, not 65. If the plan survives at 62, then working longer is upside. If it only works at 65, you are one restructuring away from a catastrophe. Adjust the plan now while the runway is still under you. The second, treat catch-up contributions as the literal highest return investment available to you. The 2026 standard 401k limit is $24,500 with an $8,000 catch-up for those 50 or older for a total of $32,500. Those between 60 and 63 qualify for an $11,250 super catch-up under the Secure 2.0 Act. These numbers are not advertising. They are a legal mechanism built specifically for the decade we're discussing. The kitchen renovation can wait. The catch-up window cannot. The third, price the healthcare gap before you price anything else about early retirement. Get an actual quote for ACA Marketplace coverage in your state at your expected income level. Put that number, not a generic estimate, an actual number into your retirement model. If the model still works, proceed. If it doesn't, that tells you what you needed to know before you quit, not after. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes. The people who proved that didn't get there by being clever. They got there by understanding that the 50s aren't the reward, they're the runway, and you only get